Hello, and welcome to another Seek and Prosper interview from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt, and I'm joined today by Oliveros-Rosen, who is Chief Economist for Emerging Markets at S&P Global Ratings. And today we're going to be discussing supply chain risk. Elijah, welcome.
Thank you, Nathan. Happy to be here.
So, Elijah, supply chains are a fascinating issue right now because we're going through this period of sort of massive upheaval with supply chains. And I think the question that I have that I think is on a lot of people's minds is, we saw this upheaval sort of develop through the intense period of the COVID pandemic. Was it the pandemic that in some ways broke supply chains, or is the disruptions we're seeing part of a longer-term series of trends that COVID just revealed?
Yeah, Nathan, excellent question. I think we think about supply chains more as one of the mega trends that we've been seeing for now several years before the pandemic. So if we think about what the mega trends are, just to put things into perspective, right? So we have artificial intelligence, we have decentralized finance, we have demographics, we have climate change, and I would put supply chain reconfiguration there. And I want to emphasize the word reconfiguration because I'm going to come back to that. And if we put things into context within supply chains, right? This is something that has been happening before the pandemic. And one way to look at it is thinking about supply chains in the context of global trade. It's obviously been a very important driver of greater global trade. And if you think about global trade dead goods as a share of GDP, in the 90s, it was 35% of GDP. Today, it's 50%. So it's been a pretty important driver of global trade in large. Now, what we're seeing today is a reconfiguration in where supply chains are being located. And one interesting statistic to emphasize this idea that this is a reconfiguration, not elimination of supply chains, is looking at the statistics out of the US. In 2023, the biggest source of imports for the US was Mexico. This is the first time in several decades that this happened. China was typically the biggest source of imports coming into the US. But the overall size of US imports hasn't changed that much. So we're just seeing a shift into where some of these imports are coming from because of how supply chains are changing.
When you are looking at companies, how do you account for the degree of supply chain risk that company might be exposed to?
Yeah. I'm going to come back to reconfiguration because I think companies are reconfiguring based on the emerging risks that we're seeing. And I'm going to point to 4 risks that I think are reflective of how things are changing. One is geopolitics. Clearly, in this fragmented world, it matters where supply chains are located. Another one is regulatory risks. Certain sectors have become strategic in terms of national security. So it matters where specific products are being produced because they can be subject to changes in regulation. We've seen that from the tariff side, and we've seen it from other types of regulations in things like electrical vehicles, batteries, minerals, etc. Another one is operational risk. We've seen an uptick in labor strikes across supply chains. A lot of these are coming from emerging markets in populations that have felt like they're being left behind. So there's more labor strikes. And finally, climate-related risks. We've seen climate have a direct impact on things like shipping and transportation. So one example is what we saw in the Panama Canal. We saw a pretty significant drought that lowered the levels of the canal that impacted freight and shipping costs.
Final question. When you look forward, let's say over the next 3 years, what do you think could be, the next major source of supply chain disruption? Do you see that as being geopolitics, obviously an issue as we've seen in the Red Sea? Do you see that as being climate, as you say, the issues in the Panama Canal? Do you see that as labor, which is been very much in the news, threats to supply chains from labor, or is it something else entirely?
It's really hard to pin one single one. I think geopolitics and climate-related risks are up there because of how unpredictable they are. Obviously, we are having a lot of challenges just to understanding how these conflicts that are currently in place will end. And climate is just a huge source of uncertainty. So those two are up there. One that I would add that sometimes is not discussed enough is energy availability, and more specifically, renewable energy availability. There's a lot of focus on becoming greener, especially among manufacturers. And there are certain parts of the world that are not prepared to offer that supply of renewable energy. One specific case is Mexico. Mexico has been a key player in the expectations of supply chain reconfiguration, right? As the U.S. shifts away from China and into Mexico. But one key obstacle for manufacturers that are trying to relocate to Mexico is having access to renewable energy. And so far, they're running into a hurdle which limits the amount of supply chain reconfiguration in Mexico.
Well, Elijah, thank you so much for joining me today. This is fascinating.
Thanks, Nathan. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining us as well. Stay tuned for other Seek and Prosper interviews coming up from S&P Global.